Something extraordinary just happened, something that historians will be writing about for decades. And most people watching cable news are being fed only half the story, the comfortable half, the part that flatters the people in charge. So let us do what good journalism is supposed to do. Let us sit down, look at the facts, follow the logic, and ask the questions that nobody in the mainstream is asking. If that sounds like the kind of television you want more of, subscribe right now. Hit like, leave a comment, tell us what you think. Because this conversation, this kind of analysis, it only stays alive if you keep it alive. Now, let us talk about the world. In the span of about 4 weeks, the United States and Iran signed what is being called a Memorandum of Understanding in Islamabad, Pakistan. The Strait of Hormuz, which had been effectively closed since February 28th of this year, the day American and Israeli warplanes launched strikes on Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the process. That strait is now, technically, reopening. 11,000 sailors are still stranded inside it, waiting to be evacuated. The oil markets are lurching. Britain just lost its 7th prime minister in 10 years. And Israel, the country that was supposed to be the biggest winner of all this, is increasingly looking like a nation that went to war, won every battle, and is somehow still losing the peace. Let us go through this, piece by piece, because the connections matter. This is not a collection of separate stories. This is one story. Start with the deal itself. On June 17th, United States President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed what is being called a Memorandum of Understanding. Notice that word, memorandum. Not a treaty, not a binding agreement ratified by Congress. A memo. The kind of thing you write when you want to look like you made a deal without actually being locked into one. The deal calls for Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile to be, in the language of the document, downblended, reduced in concentration so that it cannot immediately be used for a bomb. It waives American-backed sanctions on Iranian oil. It gives both sides 60 days to hammer out a broader agreement. And it calls for the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, without Iran charging tolls for at least those same 60 days. Now, Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, walked out of the signing and told the world that this agreement was, and I want you to hear this clearly, a declaration of America's defeat. He said it was not the result of pressure and coercion, but rather the result of the resistance and authority of the brave Iranian nation. That is the public posture of the country that just agreed to give up its leverage at the strait and dilute its nuclear stockpile. And Washington looked at that statement and did not push back forcefully. That tells you something. When your negotiating partner describes the deal you both just signed as your defeat, and you respond with silence, you have already lost the information war. You may have gained some tactical ground on the nuclear file, but you have handed Tehran a propaganda victory that will echo in that region for a generation. Now let us be precise about what the deal actually does and does not do, because there is a fundamental disagreement between Washington and Tehran about what they even agreed to. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, the body that exists specifically to verify these kinds of agreements, its Director General, Rafael Mariano Grossi, said clearly and on the record that his inspectors will return to Iran's enrichment sites. He said this is what the Memorandum of Understanding says. He pointed to the text. And then Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, got on social media and said, and again, I want you to hear the actual language, that nuclear inspections will only be permitted within the framework of a final agreement and as a result of the other party's practical action to terminate all sanctions. In plain English, Iran says no inspectors until every single sanction is lifted first. The United States says inspectors are coming regardless. The IAEA says it is going to happen. Iran says it is not. One deal, 3 different readings, and a 60-day clock ticking. Think about what that means. Iran is believed by Western intelligence assessments and by the IAEA itself to have enough highly enriched uranium, enriched to 60% purity, a level no country in the world maintains without a weapons program, to potentially build as many as 10 nuclear weapons should it choose to move quickly. Nobody can currently verify where that stockpile is, because since Israel launched its 12-day war in June of 2025, the IAEA has been blocked from visiting Iran's enrichment sites, and the country with that stockpile is now insisting it will only let inspectors in after the economic pressure on it has been completely released. That is not a confidence-building measure, that is a hostage arrangement, and Washington signed on to it. Now let us talk about the war itself and how we got here, because the context matters enormously. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched what was called Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes were extraordinary in their scope. They killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. They targeted military sites, nuclear facilities, and regime infrastructure across Iran. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones, striking American military bases in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan. The Gulf states that had been quietly cheering for American action suddenly found themselves under fire. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest in the world, was damaged and temporarily shut down. And Iran did what it had always promised it would do if pushed to the wall. It shut the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, for anyone not familiar with it, is a narrow waterway between the coasts of Iran and Oman. It is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade, along with about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, passes through it. The International Energy Agency described what happened next as the largest oil supply disruption in the history of global markets, bigger than the 1973 OPEC embargo, bigger than anything the world had ever seen in the energy trade. At the peak of the crisis, over 2,000 ships were stranded in the Persian Gulf. Approximately 20,000 mariners were trapped. Iran laid sea mines in the strait. It boarded and attacked merchant vessels. And it announced that the strait was closed to any ship going to or from the ports of the United States, Israel, and their allies. Now the strait is technically reopening. American naval escorts are guiding tankers through. 67 ships transited on a single Sunday in late June. Oil prices have dropped from their wartime peak. But here is what the headlines are not telling you. There are still 11,000 sailors stranded on ships in the Persian Gulf right now, as of this week, awaiting evacuation coordinated by the International Maritime Organization. Iran has not yet cleared the mines it laid in the Central Channel. The United States military told the House Armed Services Committee in April that it could take 6 months to fully clear those mines, and that operation was unlikely to begin until the war fully ended. War risk insurers are still refusing to fully re-enter the market until they see stable, consistent, uninterrupted transits. Ships are still doing what is called going dark, turning off their GPS tracking systems to avoid detection, which means the trade data is unreliable. The Strait of Hormuz is open the way a door is open when one hinge is still broken. It lets some things through, but it is not safe, and the world's economy is still paying the price. Goldman Sachs, which is not in the business of being dramatic, has revised its Brent crude forecast down to $80 a barrel for the fourth quarter of this year, and down to $75 for 2027. Brent was trading under $75 this week for the first time since the war began. That sounds like good news, and in one sense it is, but what it also reflects is a deep uncertainty. The International Energy Agency is forecasting an oil oversupply in 2027 if the peace holds, but a supply shortfall of nearly 4 million barrels a day in 2026 because of production losses that still have not been fully recovered from. The markets are pricing in a recovery that has not yet fully materialized, and if the ceasefire breaks, if Lebanon flares up, if Iran decides to close the strait again, if the nuclear talks collapse in the next 60 days, we go right back to where we were, possibly worse. Let us talk about Lebanon, because Lebanon is the thread that could unravel everything. When the Iran war started, Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group backed by Tehran, renewed its attacks on Israel, which triggered an intensified Israeli bombardment and an Israeli ground invasion of southern Lebanon. As of today, the Lebanese Health Ministry reports that at least 3,516 people have been killed in Lebanon since March, with over 10,000 wounded. 5 divisions of the Israel Defense Forces are deployed inside Lebanese territory. Israel has pushed north past the coastal town of Nakura, and the question of whether Israeli forces will withdraw has become the single biggest obstacle to any comprehensive peace. Here is where it gets breathtaking. A United States State Department official said this week, publicly and on the record, that Israel had already withdrawn from some of its buffer zones in southern Lebanon as a good faith gesture toward Lebanon's government. Israel said that never happened. 2 senior IDF sources directly and unambiguously denied it. Lebanon's own security officials said they were unaware of any withdrawal. The State Department did not respond to repeated requests to clarify whether its own official statement represented actual policy. So the United States government said something happened. The Israeli military said it did not happen. And the country that is supposed to be America's closest ally in the region is openly contradicting the American government in real time, in the middle of a ceasefire negotiation, while Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz simultaneously says the IDF will remain in the security zone in Lebanon at this stage, regardless of what anyone in Washington says. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated on the record that as long as he is Prime Minister, Israeli forces will maintain that security zone in southern Lebanon. This is not a nuance. This is not a matter of diplomatic interpretation. This is a client state telling its patron that it will not follow instructions, and the patron is letting it happen. The War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed by the United States Congress specifically to prevent presidents from taking the country to war without congressional authorization, a law passed in the direct aftermath of Vietnam. That law was invoked by the Senate this week in a War Powers Resolution aimed at restricting Trump's ability to continue the Iran war. The Senate actually passed it, narrowly. And then Senate Republicans were called to the Capitol by Trump, dressed down in a private meeting, and the Senate subsequently rejected a follow-up measure. Trump has made clear he will veto any war powers resolution that lands on his desk. He can do that because the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, but it does not give Congress an easy mechanism to stop a president who is already fighting one. The 1973 law was designed to address that gap. It has never been successfully enforced in 50 years, and it is not going to be enforced now. Meanwhile, Israel's exclusion from the Islamabad talks was not accidental. It was, as multiple analysts have pointed out, the entire point. Pakistan and Qatar served as the primary mediators and hosts for the negotiations. Neither of those countries has a formal relationship with Israel, and Qatar has long maintained ties with Hamas. The deal that emerged from Islamabad is structured in a way that puts Pakistan and Qatar at the center of the diplomatic architecture for whatever comes next. Iran insisted throughout the war that any ceasefire must include a halt to Israeli strikes on Lebanon. The United States tried to separate the Lebanon track from the Iran track. Iran refused to let that happen. And the result is that the Iran deal now has Lebanon baked into it, meaning that every time fighting flares up between Israel and Hezbollah, as it did this week when an Israeli soldier was killed and the IDF struck Hezbollah fighters in response, the entire diplomatic edifice shakes. Hezbollah, for its part, rejected the ceasefire deal that was agreed to between Israel and Lebanon after American brokered talks in Washington on June 3rd. Hezbollah's leader, Naim Qassem, said clearly that he is concerned only with a comprehensive cessation of aggression, a ceasefire, and the withdrawal of Israel. Hezbollah was not party to those Washington talks. Neither Hezbollah nor Israel is a signatory to the broader United States-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, which means the two entities most likely to restart the shooting, Hezbollah and the Israeli military, are operating outside the legal framework of the deal that is supposed to be ending the war. A United Nations peacekeeping soldier from Serbia was killed this week when mortars hit his position near Marjayoun in southeastern Lebanon. He is the 7th United Nations interim force in Lebanon peacekeeper to be killed since fighting resumed in March. The ceasefire exists on paper. On the ground, people are still dying. Now let us talk about Turkey and what is actually happening there, because it is one of the most underreported and consequential stories of the last several months. Trump this week said publicly that Erdogan was a prime candidate to go into the war with Iran, maybe on the Iran side, because he's not a big fan of Israel. He then credited himself with stopping that from happening. He said he personally intervened to keep Erdogan out of the war, and the headline everywhere was Trump claiming credit. But what nobody is asking is the more unsettling question. Why would a NATO member, a country with the second largest military in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance whose founding purpose was collective defense against exactly this kind of coercive threat, why would that country have been in any danger of fighting on the side of America's enemy? And more importantly, why is American policy toward Turkey now being run as a purely personal transaction between two leaders, with F-35 stealth fighter jets being dangled as the reward? Here is the background. Turkey was removed from the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program in 2019 after it purchased the Russian-made S-400 air defense system. The United States Congress passed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, known as CAATSA, specifically to sanction countries that bought significant military equipment from Russia. Turkey bought the S-400. The United States sanctioned Turkey and ejected it from the F-35 program under that law. Trump this week, ahead of a NATO summit in Ankara, signaled he is probably going to do something that will make Erdogan very happy on the F-35 question. Vice President Vance acknowledged that American law requires certain certifications before the sale can go through. And then Trump said the issue would be sorted out. Just like that, the law will be worked around. The strategic calculations of 5 years ago, the ones that correctly identified that Turkey operating both Russian air defense systems and American stealth fighters is an unacceptable security risk. Those calculations are being discarded in exchange for Erdogan's goodwill. And what has Turkey actually done to earn this? It declined to participate in the military campaign against Iran. It called for diplomacy, while American and Israeli planes were bombing Tehran. It served as a mediator alongside Pakistan and Qatar. At one point, Iranian missiles entered Turkish airspace and were intercepted by NATO air defense systems, a genuine escalation that could have brought Turkey into the conflict, whether it wanted in or not. And Turkey used that experience not to draw closer to the Western alliance, but to reinforce its position as an indispensable, go-it-alone power that cannot be taken for granted by anyone. The Brookings Institution, one of America's most prominent foreign policy think tanks, published analysis this month, noting that Turkey is increasingly building its own regional alliance architecture, one that operates behind the scenes of NATO commitments without breaking them formally. Ankara is coordinating with Qatar. It played a central role in the Islamabad process. It sits on what Trump called the Board of Peace for Gaza reconstruction. It has expanded influence in Syria after Assad's fall. It is doing all of this while technically remaining inside the NATO framework. And Washington is responding by offering it F-35s. Let us talk about China and Russia for a moment, because their silence in this entire episode is more significant than almost any statement either of them could have made. China did nothing visible during the Iran war. It did not intervene militarily. It did not cut off economic cooperation with the United States. It watched, it observed, and in doing so, it achieved something remarkable. The war removed Iranian oil from global markets for months. China, which had been buying discounted Iranian oil in enormous quantities in violation of American sanctions, was temporarily deprived of that supply. Oil prices spiked. China's energy import bill went up. That is the part of the story that looks bad for Beijing. But here is the other part. The United States spent 4 months at war. It burned through military equipment. It deployed its naval assets in the Persian Gulf to enforce the Hormuz transit. It antagonized European allies. It shook global confidence in American reliability as a security provider, and China simply waited. Every day that American resources and attention were consumed by the Iran war was a day that China was not under any new pressure in the South China Sea, not facing any new challenges over Taiwan, and not confronting any new American diplomatic initiative in Asia. Inaction was China's most sophisticated strategic move, and it cost Beijing nothing. Russia's position is almost perfectly inverse. Moscow called the American and Israeli strikes on Iran unprovoked aggression, this from a country that launched a full-scale invasion of a sovereign European nation in 2022. Russia had been supplying Iran with drone technology. It had signed agreements to fund nuclear reactors in Iran. It held joint meetings with China and Iran at the International Atomic Energy Agency in April. And now, with the ceasefire in place, Russian officials are positioning themselves as advocates for peace, quietly suggesting that their earlier opposition to the war gives them a moral standing that should translate into influence over the reconstruction of whatever new regional order emerges. That is a level of geopolitical audacity that is genuinely impressive, in a deeply cynical way. You help arm the country being bombed, you publicly condemn the bombing, you do nothing to stop it, and then when it ends, you show up to collect credit for the outcome you had nothing to do with. It would be funny if it were not so consequential. And while all of this was happening in the Middle East, Ukraine was quietly making territorial gains. Russian President Vladimir Putin was not happy about the Iran war for a reason that has nothing to do with any sympathy for Tehran. Every American missile used in Iran is a missile not going to Ukraine. Every American naval vessel patrolling the Persian Gulf is a vessel not available for other deployments. Every hour of American diplomatic energy spent on the Islamabad talks is an hour not spent pressuring European allies to maintain and increase their military support for Kyiv. Ukraine read the moment correctly and pressed its advantage on the ground while the world's cameras were pointed east. Putin is now watching a situation in which the war he started in Ukraine is grinding toward outcomes he cannot fully control. The country he thought he could isolate is still fighting, and American attention is divided in a way that was supposed to help him, but has also constrained his ability to escalate without consequences. Now let us go to Britain, because it is a story that deserves more attention than it has received outside the United Kingdom. On June 22nd, Prime Minister Keir Starmer stood outside 10 Downing Street and announced he would resign as leader of the Labour Party. He said, "The question my party is asking now is whether I am best placed to lead us into the next general election. I have heard the answer of my parliamentary party to that question, and I accept that answer with good grace." That is the language of a man trying very hard to maintain his dignity while being pushed out of the job he won in a landslide less than 2 years earlier. This makes Starmer the 7th Prime Minister that the United Kingdom will have had in 10 years. 7. In a decade. Boris Johnson. Liz Truss, who lasted 50 days and was famously outlasted by a supermarket lettuce placed next to her photograph. Rishi Sunak. And now Keir Starmer. In that same period, Germany has had 2 chancellors. France has had 2 presidents. This is not normal democratic turnover. This is political system failure in slow motion. What brought Starmer down? Several things at once. His party lost over 1,400 council seats in local elections in May. A catastrophic performance that was widely read as a referendum on his leadership. The far-right Reform UK party, led by Nigel Farage, swept those elections, winning 1,453 councillor positions, mostly from Labour, and taking control of 14 councils. Starmer had made a strategic calculation that he could outflank reform on immigration by adopting tougher rhetoric. The voters were not buying it. The people who wanted tougher immigration enforcement voted for the party that actually stood for it, not the party that was mimicking it, reluctantly. He lost the progressive wing of his party and failed to peel off enough of the right-leaning vote to make up for it. His likely successor is Andy Burnham, the former mayor of Greater Manchester, who won a special parliamentary election in Makerfield on June 18th, defeating Reform in a constituency where the far-right party had just won all the local council seats. If Burnham can do that nationally, he has a chance. But he will inherit the same structural problems that destroyed Starmer: rising energy prices linked to the Hormuz crisis, a fractured political landscape, and a global environment in which the center is being squeezed from both sides simultaneously. And Donald Trump, of all people, commented on Starmer's resignation, saying the Prime Minister had failed badly on two very important subjects: immigration and energy. The energy point is interesting because it points back to the Iran war. The Hormuz crisis drove up energy prices across Europe. Britain, which imports significant quantities of energy, felt it acutely. The government that had promised economic stability and growth found itself dealing with energy shock, inflation pressure, and the political fallout of a war it had not started, did not control, and could not end. So where does all of this leave us? Let us try to draw the map. The United States has 60 days to turn a memorandum into a treaty. That 60-day window is already being eaten up by a war of words, a phrase used by the head of the IAEA himself, between Washington and Tehran, over what the document they both signed actually means. The nuclear file is unresolved. The inspections are unresolved. The sanctions relief is contested. The Strait of Hormuz is technically open but not safe. 11,000 sailors are still waiting to go home. The Israel-Lebanon conflict is producing casualties and is not under control. Hezbollah is outside the deal. Israel is ignoring American guidance on withdrawal, while the American government publicly says things about Israeli military movements that Israel then publicly denies. Turkey is being bought rather than led, with stealth fighter jets as the currency of the transaction. Pakistan and Qatar have emerged as the central brokers of a new Middle Eastern diplomatic order, an order in which the United States is still militarily dominant but diplomatically dependent on countries it has historically treated as junior partners. China is watching and waiting. Russia is pretending to be the voice of peace. Ukraine is fighting and gaining. And Britain has lost its 7th Prime Minister in a decade, partly as a casualty of the energy price shock that the war created. None of the fundamental questions have been answered. Can Iran be permanently prevented from developing a nuclear weapon? Nobody agrees on the rules. Can Israel and Hezbollah reach a durable ceasefire? Neither side has yet committed to the terms that would make one possible. Will Turkey's drift toward autonomous regional power be arrested or accommodated? Will China's patient observation translate into gains in Asia while America is distracted? Will Ukraine's battlefield momentum survive a negotiating environment in which a war-weary American president may eventually decide that one conflict at a time is enough? What we know for certain is this: the world that existed on February 27th of this year, the day before Operation Epic Fury, is gone. The regional order in the Middle East is being renegotiated from scratch. The architecture of American alliances is under enormous strain. And the deal that is supposed to stabilize all of this is a 60-day memorandum that both sides are already interpreting differently, signed in the capital of a country, Pakistan, that was not even formally part of the conflict, brokered by a Qatar that has been accused by foreign intelligence reports of having aided Iran economically and militarily for years. That is the world today, not as it is being sold to you, as it actually is. And we will be here every week to keep telling you what is actually happening. Not the comfortable version, not the version that flatters the people in charge, but the honest, documented, sourced, argued version that you deserve. Subscribe, share this, because this kind of journalism does not survive without an audience that demands it. And right now, the world needs it more than ever.